People who give job interviews, what are some subtle red flags that say, this person won't be a good hire? Story 1. When asked about their experience with a topic, they stick to reciting textbook definitions of terminology rather than demonstrating any understanding of how to apply it. Had one person who was literally forwarding our questions into ChatGPT and then reciting rambling answers that provided definitions of keywords in our questions rather than actually answering the question. Like, we'd ask, what's something a previous employer or educator has recognized you for? And they'd answer, examples of things that an employer might recognize an employee for are... Story 2. I once had a guy show up, late, with blood all over his face and clothes looking really disheveled. Typically, I don't waste my time with people who can't even make it to their interview on time. But this guy said that he was in a car accident on his way to the interview and got there as soon as he could. After the interview, he asked if there was any way he could get a ride back to where his car was. Believing his story, I offered him the ride. This man's car was nearly 5 miles away, legitimately crashed, and it turns out someone had broke into his car and stolen his child's car seat and his stereo system during the couple hours he was gone. I hired him. He turned out to be really difficult to work with, but the guy was a programming genius. Kept him for years before he moved on. I don't hire liars. This guy wasn't one. Story 3. Due to the nature of roles I interview for, I often get people with PhDs, and they split into 2 categories. I've done my homework and I'm ready to answer any question. Good. And I am better than this job, and you will give it to me, but I'll join the charade bad, like really bad. Also, top tip. If you apply for an information specialist role, don't fudge your own information. We will do due diligence and we will understand whether you are trying to big yourself up, regardless of your background, nationality. Story 4. I work in politics and hire a lot of entry-level positions. With some firms, the only qualification is a pulse. In the screening call, pre-interview, I ask them about an issue that they care about. This is to first weed out anyone that doesn't have a clue what is going on, and also to weed out someone on the other side of the aisle. It very much is a partisan position. One person last year slipped up and somehow passed the screening call. In our office, there were cardboard cutouts of 3 prominent political figures, 2 presidents and a VP, all household names at this point. He got to the office, saw the cardboard cutouts, and asked who they were. Story 5. When interviewing people, I always try to find a way to subtly disagree or challenge one of their positions, whether I really disagree or not, and their reactions mostly fall in 3 categories. They agree with me. Take it as a learning opportunity. Green flag. They confidently back up their claim with supporting statements. Very green flag. They get defensive, territorial that I've challenged them. Red flag. Story 6. One of my weaknesses is I work too hard. Edit. Thank you all for the comments. I think this question is stupid and needs to be rephrased. When I get asked this question, I like to answer it by talking about self-improvement. Here's mine. If I come up on a problem, my first instinct is to dive right in and start figuring stuff out. Sometimes this causes me to miss something. For example, there is already a document that exists to solve the exact problem. And if I would have taken 5 minutes to stop, think, and utilize resources, I wouldn't be going in circles. Story 7. It's a really, really bad idea to be combative with the interviewer. I'm legit trying to help you succeed, and I make a concentrated effort to make you feel at ease. If a question or request doesn't make sense to you, that's fine. Let's talk about it. If you answer defensively, bordering on aggression, it's really not going to go well. And you may get the answer right, but the question I'm asking myself is if I want to deal with you every day, especially considering this was likely your best behavior. Story 8. When I call in a group to interview, I give simple instructions. Bring your ID, a pen, a piece of paper. 90% of the people who show fail to bring those 3 things and immediately get rejected. Can't follow simple instructions. Then why in the hell would I trust you with #1000s of equipment on jobs where you could cost me 10s of $1000s? Story 9. I was in management for a daycare and it became pretty easy to identify the red flags. Unfortunately, we were always so hurt for employees we'd hire them anyway. I know it's kind of a meme, but if you immediately let me know your UL orientation, I knew it was going to bad. Like I had several candidates essentially open up with how they were gay, their race, and why their life was tough, which I get it. We are in the South, it sucks. But like, how do you feel about changing diapers? And we'd hire them anyway, and they'd immediately get into it with a parent. Story 10. I've done a few interviews, and while not exactly subtle, you'll get passed over if you don't have an answer for a standard interview question. My workplace, like many large firms, interviews with pre-prepared questions and a scoring template in an effort to remove bias. If you don't have an answer, you get the minimum score for that section, which will often put you behind anyone that didn't bomb the interview. Folks, always have an example of how you've dealt with workplace conflict and problem you found and solved, and a project or task you saw through to completion with how you overcame some challenges. That's some basic stuff right there. Also, we have a standard question about the importance of DEI at the start of the interview, and everyone that said, "I don't see color," threw the panel right off. I understand that it can be said in good faith, but it's often a cover phrase for folks that don't really believe in the importance of diversity in the workplace by dismissing the benefits. Story 11. I once interviewed a woman that was chewing gum the entire time. I don't remember any of her answers because all I could think was, I can't believe she's chewing gum while talking. Had another lady interviewing for a personal assistant to company owner who said that we could not run a background check on her. Neither were hired. Story 12. The same ones you look for when making friends. At the end of the day, this person will spend a third of their day or more at the job. That being said, super negative. They never do anything wrong or can't think of something they can improve. Trash. Talking their former employer, talking more than listening, cutting you off, etc. Story 13. Anyone that leads with how important it is that his or her boundaries need to be respected is for sure going to be a pain in the ass to employ. Unless you're some rock star in your field, you should go into any interview with the assumption that there are 10 other people willing to work harder and for less. If you're comfortable enough walking away from the job, then you can hold out and demand more. But if you need the job, know that to distinguish yourself, the employer wants to see someone who is going to help him or her succeed. Story 14, I have a few. If they misspell my very common name in the cover letter. If they don't follow the clear rules on how to apply for the job. I had someone send their resume through an email change for existing customers. It said they hadn't realized that was even possible. The kicker was the first line of their letter is, they keep close attention to detail. Any mention of, they don't want me to waste their time. Story 15. I used to host Zoom interviews for a bit. The amount of people who would be 10 plus minutes late astounded me. It was an immediate no hire for me. If you can't open your laptop and click on a link on time, I don't trust you to show up to shifts on time. Bonus points for being late plus obviously laying in bed. Story 16. Software engineer, I always keep asking questions until I find something they don't know. If they don't say I don't know at that point, huge red flag. Nobody knows everything. Being able to recognize when you've encountered a subject outside of your knowledge is essential. Story 17. They're wearing pajamas. I had to hire entry-level staff to work for an airline. Everything from checking people in to pushing wheelchairs and throwing luggage. Over the course of 2 weeks of hiring, I had 3 different people show up for interviews wearing their pajamas. One of them had a robe, a do-rag, and a beat-up stuffed animal and kept sucking on a pacifier. Needless to say, I didn't hire any of them, but to this day, I still don't get why they bothered to set up the appointment, take the time and effort to get there, get through security, etc., but didn't think it was important to put on actual clothing. Story 18. I interviewed a girl that seemed okay. A little weird and quirky, but hey, we are all weird. Could have used some more experience in the field, but if we started her with low and she worked her way up, it probably would have been fine. Another manager took her to the facility and I got a text from my supervisor to come outside to the parking lot area. He was standing behind this girl's car and did the quiet, loud whisper of, "Get over quick." I walk over and there is the largest bumper sticker that says, "I eat ass." My supervisor turned and looked at me and said, "You are not hiring her," proceeds to walk away. Needless to say, with a facility that had kids around frequently, we did not hire her. I thought it was kind of funny, maybe not something you publicly announce though. True irony of it all though, was the supervisor was a notorious slut, was on Grindr all the time and had his lovers come to the facility. Guess he was a top and not a bottom. Story 19. I was hiring someone with web development skills. Asked a candidate to tell me about a time they encountered a critical error and how they fixed it. Their response, well, I was on our website and noticed some information was out of date, a critical error. So I told the web development team we needed to update that critical error. Story 20. Had 2 interviews for a software dev position this year that stood out. First one, the guy was well into the interview and going through the coding portion when the door opened behind him. A woman stepped in and asked something about reports and to wrap up what he was doing. When she left, he turned back to the screen and said he was sorry, but he had to go and ended the call. Second was a guy who was doing all right, but halfway through the interview, he just stopped responding to us. Call wasn't frozen. He just stopped talking, responding. Then the call just ended, and we never heard anything from him again, even after reaching out to see if he had connection issues and wanted to reschedule. Story 21. Candidate submitted a take-home test by email. They forgot to excise the text of the email reply chain with their buddy, in which if you scrolled far enough, you could see A, their buddy helped them with the test, actually buddy did most of it, and B, the two of them weighing up the finer points of a drug deal they were participating in. Story 22. Most of these answers aren't subtle at all. An example of a subtle red flag in an interview is someone who can only provide examples of how they helped the group achieve goals. If you give them lots of opportunity to talk about how they overcame challenges, dealt with unexpected results, had to adjust timelines, etc., and they can only give examples of how we solved the problem, I found that to be a red flag. You may initially think, this person seems to be a real team player and collaborates on everything. But my anecdotal experience with this type of employee is that they, more often than not, tend to be freeloaders who skate by just being in close proximity to the action, but not doing much themselves. As soon as you give them direct responsibility for an initiative, they don't know what to do, or they try to pawn it off on those around them under the guise of being collaborative. So my advice during an interview, make sure you explain exactly how you specifically took action to solve the issue. I don't care about the end state of your project. I care about the logic, drive, and responsibility you demonstrated in getting there. Story 23. Main and most common red flags are, they treat employees not related to their interview badly. That is being rude to reception, admin, or HR staff who do checks and emails to confirm interviews. So many people will be rude to them and then act surprised when I phone them and tell them they have been rejected. Only once did I let someone interview after being rude to admin, and that was mainly because it was just so strange. They turned up at the office with their parents in tow because they didn't like the date we offered for the interview and insisted we reschedule. After the first 3 interview questions, I had to end it and call a mental health crisis team because it was clear they were in the midst of a full-blown psychosis. They don't research the company they are applying to. So many people think they can sweet-talk their way through a full interview without knowing anything at all about the company. The red flag here, though, isn't that they don't know anything. It's that they made things up. They try to tell you what they know and get it very, very wrong. Even just admitting you don't know is better than getting caught out. You can sort of skate by and show an interest in wanting to learn more about the company and be honest about the little you do know. They avoid giving negatives about themselves completely. Even when I specifically narrow them down to the point and ask them to reflect on a weakness directly, they pick a positive trait and try to downplay it like a weakness. My experience interviewing hundreds of people tell me that this is just a variation of lying, and they are usually hiding some big flaws. No one is perfect. I specifically pick out people with weaknesses that we can manage and help them work on. For example, I hired someone who said they played off being a perfectionist as a negative, and boy were they right. The person couldn't keep up with the workload and eventually quit. But the other person I hired who said they had depression and had periods where they struggled with work-life balance was a great fit after giving them flexibility on hours. They were so grateful and happy to be part of a supportive employer, they worked twice as hard as anyone else. Overall, I found that people who are very confident at interviews and those who generally score really well are what I call a 50-50ths hire. Often they are the first to leave and take a better offer at a competitor or have serious baggage and are often much harder to read as they can talk themselves through an interview easily and hide their flaws or problems, which always come out eventually. I feel most comfortable and confident hiring people who are not perfect, but still have a willingness to develop and improve themselves. Usually people in this range are very good at their jobs and just get nervous or struggle giving themselves praise to strangers. In the end, the only real way to know is to test them out and see how they get on during probation. The main thing I'd say is make sure you know what kind of person you're looking for, and that will guide your decision during interviews. Do you want someone who can hit the ground running and really competent and skilled, but may not last very long, or someone who you will likely see much more value out of in the long term with a bit of development? Story 24. I'm not anyone who makes hiring decision, but I'm often invited to interviews to give feedback on candidates. Something that almost always kills the offer letter is negativity. We just had a fantastic candidate, but she found a way to complain about everything. The state she was from, too boring. The state we are in that she just moved to, too cold. Past jobs, too mundane, bad leadership, etc. Even some of her family members received jabs, currently living with sister who's too messy. She said everything with a smile on her face and was generally pleasant, but we couldn't get past the fact that she had something negative to say about everything. Doesn't really scream team player, good fit. Story 25. I'm a mechanical engineer and I have to interview candidates from time to time. In general, I give them a really simple technical question that I would expect a high schooler to solve. It's literally going to be things like, calculated the force on this object. The more you deviate away from force equals mass times acceleration, the more I know you're going to be a bad hire. Not only does it show a fundamental misunderstanding of the material at hand, it also shows me that when you don't know the answer, you're prone to taking up meeting time endlessly pointing out true but impossible to solve problems. Story 26. My favorite story of red flags was when I screened resumes for a restaurant. A couple walked in dirty, disheveled, and reeking of weed. This is long before it was legal, and asked for applications. They were paper then. They popped at the bar to fill them out, and the woman goes, babe, what's my zip code? I'm so high right now. Then about 5 minutes later, as they're handing the applications to me, the guy goes, hey, are we getting interviewed now? I got kids in the car. The woman interrupted, they're fine, they're in car seats. I was horrified it was January. Ran the papers up to the owner in her office, repeated both comments. She looks outside, jots down the plate number, and called the local cops. When the cops got there, the two of them were trying to get free beers from the bar manager. I'm not sure what happened from there. When I clocked out, the cops had them outside and CPS was involved. So, yeah, don't come to apply for a job, have an interview high, smelling and begging for booze while your toddlers wait in the car in the cold. Story 27. Inability to reason through a problem. Every answer is, I'll ask my manager. This seems to be a cultural thing with some people. Overly negative talk. Unable to provide good examples of experience when asked. Being so nervous, it impairs ability to answer questions. Overuse of jargon and corporate speak tends to be covering up a lack of actual answer. Clearly looking things up while doing a Zoom interview. Making up nonsense answers instead of saying, I don't know. Listing every technology known to man in your resume, but actually having no experience in 90% of them. Inability to make any sort of small talk, clear lack of social skills. Unnatural speaking, trying hard to follow a script like you memorized a how to do an interview video or something. No understanding or knowledge of the company or what we do. Clearly did no research at all prior to interview. Never stayed at a job more than a few months. Story 28. Maybe I'm old school, but the killer is when the interviewee has no idea what your business does and or doesn't have a story as to why they want to work for you, no matter how qualified or smart they are. To me, this shows complacency. And if you hire, you'll be interviewing in a few months when the interviewee finds the next big thing. Story 29. I work with animals for a living. I'm not the supervisor who's going to write you up for mistakes, but I do want you to be honest with me about mistakes because we're dealing with living creatures. So I ask what's a mistake you made and how did you rectify it? Question. Some people think it's a bad, unfair question, but I like it. I've had people tell me they've never made a mistake at work. Not really a subtle red flag. And then some people just say they never did it again for the rectify part. So you didn't tell anyone or do anything about it? Story 30. If they no call, no show for an interview and then call me in a panic a day later. Nope. I've had plenty of candidates call before an interview to say they were running late or had an emergency. They were very ill and had to reschedule. No problem happens. You might be an awesome candidate on paper, but if the position is not important enough to you to double check your calendar, the confirmation email, etc., then I don't want you. Maybe you had a brain fart. Maybe you had a bad day. But who cares? We all do. Communication is the key. I'm not going to hold anyone's hand. Better luck next time. Story 31. Intensely bitter about his divorce. Brought up his bitch ex-wife a dozen times and his restraining order. Wasn't like she had any relationship with us. He was just angry venting. But a person who can't control their emotions in an interview is sure to be a problematic employee. Different one, let me know it was okay if he stole from us down the road because we have insurance for that. Yeah, no lol. Arriving to the interview tweaking on a stimulant isn't a good look either. Story 32. For a hotel cleaner job I was hiring for, I showed the candidates a hotel room that needed cleaning after a guest had checked out and asked them to identify what things needed to be done. Anyone who couldn't get more than dusting, make the bed, and hoover the floor was a fail. I mean, changing the sheets is pretty basic. Story 33. When I asked about his hands-on experience, he was referring to the plural. I'd ask, how do you place a catheter? His response would be, first we would bring the patient out, then we'd prep the needle, etc. I'd ask, describe the process of which you take a blood draw. He'd say, the team would gather all the supplies, etc. It gave me the impression that he didn't have any hands-on experience, but instead watched or assisted other people. Story 34. I'm an Irish guy in Canada, and our talent acquisition manager also happens to be Irish. For whatever reason, my accent has become pretty diluted and more Canadian, whereas my colleague's accent has stayed very Irish. We had an applicant ask my colleague why he's so hard to understand, while I'm easier to understand, and then went on to mock his accent for the last 2 minutes of the interview. Not sure what she'd get out of insulting the accent of a person that's responsible for hiring her. Story 35. I once had a guy that when asked about his previous employment, he started on a tangent about how he made so much money on one of his freelance regular gigs and how important his previous positions were. You need not be an expert in recruiting. I'm certainly not, to see his arrogance. My thoughts all the time I was speaking to him was, then why did you apply to an administrative position that pays nowhere near what you deserve? The job post was very clear on the salary. Story 36. I've been part of an interview team a handful of times at my job, which is oil and gas engineering. I'm 40, and it sometimes feels weird asking a 65-year-old applicant if they're qualified for XYYZ when they have like 30 years more experience than I do. But the biggest concern in my industry is when a 100% traveling field engineer operator comes into an office position. Those two things hardly work out due to behavioral differences. You're essentially mixing blue and white collar, and some of the white collars are snobs. Or the obvious too many jobs in a short time. Story 37, subtle one. I've noticed a couple of times, but when you ask them where they want to be in 3 years, 5 years, etc., and they answer with running my own business, be my own boss, or something vague along those lines. The fact they don't even have something they're passionate about that they want to turn into a business, and they basically just don't want someone telling them what to do, just screams laziness and bad attitude. Maybe I just got a couple of bad examples of it, but I saw half a dozen who said it in their interview, and all of them had a TI attitude, even working for a really lax manager. Story 38. I've conducted several interviews for software engineer positions. Don't put anything on your resume that you don't actually know about. Sure, it makes your resume look great, but as soon as I ask a question about it and you can't answer, you aren't getting the job. Also, don't show up to the interview obviously intoxicated. Story 39. Interviewing for a job serving seniors in the community. Government job with set starting salary, step increases, etc. A cocky younger guy came in for an interview and immediately started trying to negotiate salary. I hadn't even asked him questions yet. I showed him a printout of our pay scales, starting salary, etc., and explained that it's not negotiable. Dude, who apparently couldn't listen, then immediately proposed that I somehow combine the FT and PT positions that were open and give them both to him. Not a word about how he could serve our elderly clientele, just what's in it for me. Story 40, subtle. He didn't have enough characters in his CCNA certificate number. Less subtle, I looked it up while his would-be boss asked him some softball questions. Once Cisco said it couldn't be found tracked, I asked him what was going on. Oh, I'm working on it, should have it in 6 months. Yeah, Cisco doesn't give a CCNA cert to someone that's still working to pass the test. Story 41. Had a management position open and a quality applicant came in on time and was well-dressed for interview. Halfway through, we had a great interview and I could sense he was already sure he had the job. His body language started changing and he relaxed more and more, pushing back from the table and stretching his arms. Eventually, a full back stretch with a yawn. Then he proceeded to order pizza for his daughter and himself, so it would be there when he got home. He started discussing the commute and how much time he would have to dock from the workday for that. Shook his hand and never spoke to him again. Story 42. Showing up on time is probably my biggest. Showing up in appropriate clothing. Their current employment uniform attire is fine if coming straight from work. Cursing multiple times. Show you want to be there and want the job by doing simple stuff like sit up straight, be interested in what I'm saying. Resume that has 100 previous jobs on it is bad. Personally, I like to see a one-sheet resume. I don't need 4 pages of filler. Story 43. If they can't actually answer the questions, and I don't mean I'm not sure, let me think about it. I mean they give some rambling response that never actually answers the question. If they seem to have strong opinions about things that shouldn't be that big of a deal, they usually make bad coworkers. If they allude in any of their answers to anger issues, I hire a lot of entry level, and you'd be surprised by how many of them, when asked to tell me about a time there was a conflict at work, what they will admit to. If they can't use basic technology for the interview process, we are tech software CRM heavy. If they can't own mistakes. So when I ask about times there have been problems at work, and they skate around their involvement instead of owning it, what I do look for: good work ethic, humility, emotional intelligence, ability to take constructive feedback. Story 44. I had a perfectly nice woman come in for an interview, lied about her education. I knew because the diploma mill she listed quite famously doesn't exist anymore, but she said she was a current student set to graduate in 2 years. Honestly, if she hadn't lied, we would have hired her. But once I pointed that out in the post-game meeting, everyone lost any enthusiasm they had. Story 45. I had an applicant directly tell me that he was fired from his last job for theft. He just volunteered the information. I didn't even ask. He might not realize, but most companies won't actually provide any substantial info on past employees for legal reasons. They generally just confirm that they were employed and leave it at that. Story 46. I'd say not being aware of who you're applying to is a big red flag. I once worked for a local retailer in Maine, and at the time they did group interviews for potential employees. This was likely to see how well we'd be able to speak to customers and build team camaraderie. We had just gotten to the quanda part of the interview, where everyone was asked the most lowball question of, "What do you love about the outdoors?" Well, this one older lady very loudly and proudly informed the room that she does not like going outside. She said it was full of animals and bugs, always got her shoes dirty, and she has everything she loves inside her house. We were applying for LL Bean, whose motto is literally be an outsider, so safe to say she didn't get hired. Story 47. When I'm interviewing for senior developer positions, I don't usually waste much time on code writing skills. I can see in your resume those sorts of things. Sure, people can fake it, but at 15 years experience, it's a lot harder to do. So what I like to do is just hold a conversation and ask them about their last project. Start with what they did, then ask how that fit into the entire workflow. Ask how that workflow impacted their customer. If all that person could do is tell me the very specific thing they worked on, I'll usually pass. At the senior level, I need folks that are curious and able to connect their work with other areas of the business. I can hire a junior to just write code or solve small business requirements. Story 48. I have a pair of questions that I usually ask in an interview. You worked with a team of other employees at your last job. How did you work together with them, and what were your processes for collaborating and interacting when needed? Followed by, it's common for teams to have a few members who are hard to work with. Tell me about how you've handled that with your previous teams. You'd be shocked at the number of people who will start absolutely ting on their former coworkers when these questions come up. You'll notice that with both of those questions, I wasn't asking about the former coworkers. I was asking the applicant about their own behavior and actions. And yet, given the opening, I've seen applicants just absolutely roast their former teammates time after time. It's a red flag, often indicating that the applicant will be adversarial if they're hired and placed onto one of our teams. Story 49. A guy I know that works in the IT industry told me when a girl he interviewed for a junior developer job had a complete meltdown and completely froze. The interview ended awkwardly, and that was that. A couple days later, the girl sent an email explaining she had issues with anxiety and asked for a second chance. Of course, my friend gave her that chance. She nailed it and got hired. She now works as a product owner after 5 years with the company. Story 50. I ask, what did you learn from this previous experience? The bad ones usually say they learn not to trust other people. They learn not to depend on people. They pretty much put all of the undesirable things on their environment. It'll be a pattern. They can never admit weakness or say that they weren't a good fit, which can happen. I use that with other things though too. How much do you blame others? Story 51. My dad told me if a person shows up for an interview with a Coke or coffee in their hand, they will show up to work with a Coke or coffee in his hand. Dad said if he was going to hire a person who could only use one hand, they should have only one hand. Friend said if a person has to borrow a pen to fill out an application, they showed up unprepared and they will show up to work the same way. Story 52. Ignoring advice and hints. In tech, it's pretty common for there to be a dialogue between interviewer and interviewee when doing a difficult problem on the whiteboard. Some problems are actually designed so you don't have enough info without asking questions. It's okay to struggle a little and need some guidance, but ignoring that guidance is pretty much an instant no hire, even if your solution ends up being pretty close in the end. Why? Because we're not just testing your coding skills. We're testing your communication and how you work with teammates. If we hire you, the next time we work on a problem together, it might be one where neither of us just knows the answer. And in that situation, you need to be able to collaborate instead of just charging past to work on your own idea. Story 53. In interviews, the is a volley back and forth of listening. First a question, then an answer, clarifications. Then the volley continues as the conversation continues. There are people who, it becomes clear, think what they have to say, as the person being interviewed, is the only thing that matters. They aren't listening deeply to the context you provide, the questions you ask, things you are really asking for when you ask them to clarify what their role was in a project, etc. I don't think it's intentional, but the vibe is I am here now and it's the ME show, and you are here to get to know me, which is true in a sense, but it's a two-way street and conversation. I flee from these people because it suggests to me they will continue that pattern and role. Story 54. Called someone up for a phone screening. I was asking her generally easy technical questions to see if she qualified to go through our interview process. She was whispering all her answers and I could barely hear her, and I asked her to speak up and she said she can't cause she's in a meeting at work. That's when I realized that the voice I kept hearing in the background wasn't a TV but a person speaking, giving a speech or something. I told her to try to reschedule with us. We ended up not having her in for an interview. Story 55. The last time I was interviewing for a position, I had 2 red flags. One person kept interrupting me. Another told me she'd only been at her current position for 7 months, but she's the best in her department. She said she gets her work done faster than everyone else and knows everything there is to know. Her resume also stated she was detail-oriented. Strange because her current place of employment was misspelled on the very same resume. Story 56. I've given a few interviews and made recommendations. Effectively, the decision is my boss trusted me on who to hire twice. Not exactly a huge sample. Anyway, in all the interviews and after we were settled in, I said, right, I'm going to throw you a really difficult question. I don't care if you know the answer. I want to understand your thought process and how you respond. Please explain your thinking in giving the answer you do give. Anyway, most people do that. They say they don't know but would do XYZ to find out. Others try to eyeball it with estimates and guesswork, etc. One guy, he just gave a very confidently wrong answer and refused to elaborate. Yeah, pal, that's not what I asked. Story 57. I had a guy one time that kept going on and on about his attention to detail and how meticulous he was in everything he did. He had on his resume that he served in the Air Force, but when I brought it up, he said he had actually served in the Navy. That's a pretty big mistake to make on your resume, but I can let that slide, except he kept referring to his time in the Air Force. Then I noticed that his tie was on backwards. I'm assuming he loosened it the last time he wore it and then just put it on still tied, but didn't pay attention to the fact that he put it on backwards. So much for his great attention to detail. And when I was done with the interview, which surprisingly didn't take very long, before I could even stand up to shake his hand, he jumped up and literally ran out the door. Story 58. Pinnacles of perfection are red flag city for me. In a prior role, we regularly hired for positions that would require a level of independent working capacity and regularly interacting with very smart but difficult employees. As a result, we loaded the panel with questions that gave some indicator of honesty / owning problems / cooperative behavior, etc. Example would be, we all make mistakes. Tell me about a time where you made a mistake or failure on the job. How did you respond? And what was the end result? The sheer amount of people who would tell us they never once made a mistake or had never once failed at anything, personality or professionally in their life, was awe-inspiring. Even nudging them by interviewers on the panel joking about times we made errors led right back to, nope, never. I am perfection incarnate. Story 59. I had a guy stride into an interview in a suit right out of 1996, along with a similarly aged briefcase. He slammed the briefcase down on the table and opened it to take out his interview material. So, he made a pretty dramatic and aggressive entrance. He then used as one of his examples of knowledge-seeking skill about his internet research into conspiracy theories. He even had a list of YouTube videos for us to check out. It was very bizarre, but makes for a funny story. Story 60. Regardless of the circumstances, trash-talking your current or previous job manager is not a good look. If an interviewer asks why you're leaving or why you quit, give a positive or neutral response, such as, I want to invest my time in a company that I see myself progressing in the future. Or, I would like to explore other opportunities and feel this role is a great fit for me. Both imply to the interviewer that you see their company as a place you would like to work at long term and simultaneously avoids negativity. Story 61. Mine's kind of sad. The company I worked for years ago thought people who had empathy were a red flag. I was a manager for a large pet store chain. We didn't sell cats or dogs, but we had fish, small furry animals like hamsters and gerbils, and reptiles, etc. Corporate specifically didn't want me to hire people who cared too much for the animals. They just wanted them to clean cages / tanks and not complain about the animals' well-being. When interviewing people, I was told to turn away people who had animal rescue rehabilitation background because it was a red flag. I ignored them and hired the best people for the job. We would get live animal deliveries and half of them would be dead on arrival. The animal department workers would complain and corporate would fire them. The people that I hired would say things like, gerbils need to dig and burrow. I agreed, but corporate said we have to give them a 1/4 inch of paper substrate at the bottom of the cage to save money, even if the gerbils are scratching themselves bloody by trying to burrow through the bottom of the tank. So corporate fired the complainers. We put tons of extra substrate to accommodate the gerbils, and corporate would say, what is this extra 25C a month coming from? There was a scarlet macaw that had had an infection, and they told me I couldn't take it to a vet because they wouldn't make any money if someone ever bought it. It was my dream job because I love animals, and I worked my way up from the bottom just to realize how dark and disturbing the industry is. Story 62 years ago, A guy interviewed for an administrative position at a software training company that did projects mainly for the government. There were a lot of top brass in suits and the minions in khaki pant type of place, like The Office. This dude checked off all the boxes and was hired. The dude then sent a singing telegram dressed in a chicken suit to do a song and dance, thanking the primary manager for the job. The old man CEO was there that day and just sat there stone-faced and angry while the chicken danced and sang. It was incredibly awkward and out of place. Like The Office, the guy's offer was pulled. Story 63. I don't have much to add about my own interview and hiring practices because they've all been covered, but I wanted to share my mom's. My mom is a badass. Story for a different thread. She has MS. Her particular symptoms aren't obvious because they're mostly cognitive and balance-related. She had to stop walking upstairs almost immediately after her diagnosis. Relevant for later. Anywho, she was the director of the largest department at her company. While she didn't participate in many hiring boards, she did interview for upper management positions. Before each interview, she would meet with the interviewee in the lobby and introduce herself by name but not title and give a tour of the building. When it was time to take them upstairs, she would have to take them in the elevator. So many people criticized her for not taking the steps since it's healthier or to lose weight. This was an automatic disqualification for obvious reasons. When she would walk the interviewee into the interview room, she would always take her position at the head of the table and reintroduce herself as the director. She said that every time it happened, she could see the interviewee deflate. Oftentimes, their interviews would go downhill really fast once they realized they insulted their potential future boss. Sometimes people really just tell you who they are in the most mundane moments. Story 64. Everybody lies on their resume. Don't lie about something I, as an interviewer, would be reasonably expected to proficient with. Like if I'm hiring a level 2 engineer, you can expect that I did that job at some point. If I'm hiring a subject matter expert, way different story. I've had dudes come in that claim to be experts in C, C++, Java, Python, etc., but their experience when you ask about it is like, oh yeah, I took a class in college a couple years back, but I don't really know how to use them. Same thing with languages. Don't say you're conversational in Spanish if you took a year of it in high school. I have zero use for Spanish in positions I'm hiring for, but if you feel the need to stick it in a resume for me to see, then I feel obligated to ask you about it. It's all about telling lies that I can't hard call you on. I'm not going to call your college to confirm you were the vice captain of the pickleball club and were responsible for handling club funds and setting up matches against other schools. I'm not going to call the food bank in the city you lived in 6 years ago to see if you really did volunteer there once a month. I will absolutely ask for technical certification details if you claim that you got them. TL, doctor. I know you're going to lie, but if you can't lie well enough that I can easily figure out you're lying, it generally indicates a lack of critical thinking skills. Story 1. Most of my input goes toward my specific job, which is a social work position that requires people to be caring and empathetic enough to connect to a person, but detail-oriented enough to keep up with state guidance. The main one my interview team comments is if anybody took the time to figure out what we do. That tells us they at least visited our website and tried to be informed. We are a nonprofit and cannot put money towards advertising ourselves, but we do have a website. Part of our job is finding and sharing community resources. If they can't find our website to figure out what we do, I doubt they will be able to do the same to help somebody find a resource. We also check to see how well people handle boundaries. It's a key thing, being able to set and enforce boundaries with the people we support. If they talk about going above and beyond in past jobs, it's important that what they did empowered somebody else to do the thing themselves. Not that the applicant swooped in and saved the day by doing it. I pay attention to how much a person rambles. Our work is with people that have developmental disabilities and often need some help to stay focused and on task during our work. If the applicant can't stay on topic enough to tell me their 3 biggest strengths, I'm going to doubt they have the tools to keep another person on topic during meetings they are leading. Similarly, do their responses agree with each other? If the applicant tells us things on different prompts that are contradictory, I start to question what parts of the interview are accurate. I got in assuming the applicant is being truthful and accurate to their information, but that goes out the window when they start being contradictory to each other. I pay attention to the questions they ask when given the space, but I don't get twisted up if they don't have any questions. Before I see them, they go through a phone interview with one of our HR people. They get most of their questions answered there. The main one is specifics around work-from-home opportunities, and I feel I should explain this as it already sounds like a manager being upset about work from home, and that's not the case. I think working from home is great, and that more of the world should move in that direction. My job, though, requires seeing people face-to-face. As such, Our expectation is that people spend roughly 2 days a week in office and can do up to 3 days working from home. Those face-to-face meetings are not a thing we can budge on. It's entirely a state-mandated thing. If somebody is very focused on how much they can work from home, what I see is somebody focused on that one aspect of our job, and that being the main draw. If that's the main draw, we will lose them within a year to a job that allows full work from home options. We can't compete with that. So if an applicant wants work from home more than they want the social work job, it's going to be a waste of time. Employees often aren't fully independent until over a year in. That's a long commitment to be developing somebody. I need to be confident that they want to make that commitment too.